Okay, so we've got a good number of folks. I'll go ahead and get started just to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. You got an email reminder this morning from Crew Philadelphia. It contained a worksheet for this event. If you haven't downloaded it yet, take a minute to pop into your email and get that up. In the meantime, I'm gonna first thank our sponsors for this event. They're projected up on the screen here. My name is Emma Fox. I'm in marketing and BD with Kimley Horn. We are a multidisciplinary civil design consulting firm. We have an office here in Philly as well as 95 offices across the country. Today, we will be learning from Tyler Enslin. He specializes in keynotes, breakouts, and workshops on professional development. And you might remember him from last year. We hosted him for his workshop on Achievement Now, Success Characteristics, which was a really big hit with our Crew Philly folks. And we are really excited to have him back. So with that, I will hand it over to Tyler.
All right, well, anyway, what I was saying was thank you guys for hopping on today. I know when we originally scheduled this was supposed to be an in-person event. So I appreciate your flexibility. And it's nice to see such a good group here as we get started. So as Emma mentioned, our topic for today's training is effective feedback, giving and receiving effective feedback. So 3 main areas that we're going to discuss in the workshop today. Number 1, we'll talk about some of the common barriers or challenges that we face when we have to give someone feedback and also when we get feedback. Number 2, we'll talk about core principles that really impact the culture around feedback, how naturally it happens, how people view it in your organization, whether your organization is large or small. And number 3, we'll talk about specific techniques or tools that you can use when you're giving someone feedback and also when you're getting feedback that can help you to be a little bit more skilled. So if you have this handout that Emma mentioned, that's great. It'll serve as a nice guide for you to take some notes and kind of follow along in today's training. If you don't have it, that's totally fine. But if you're able to print it, it'll serve as a nice guide for today. All right, so I want to begin with a question. And it's a question for you all, actually. So this program has a good bit of interaction. And you can answer this either audibly, if you're able to do that, or you can drop your answers in the chat box, whichever's better for you. So we want to start by defining what effective feedback really is. And to do that, let's begin with a question. What would you say is the difference, or are some of the differences that you've noticed between feedback and criticism? Because sometimes there's a fine line between those two things. We've all experienced both. Oh, hey, I can see all of you now. We've all experienced both of them. But what would you say, what's the difference between feedback and criticism? Any thoughts?
Hi, good morning. This is Kathy Fay from Philadelphia. How are you? Thanks for coming back. I think my personal opinion, if you as a presenter are coming from a place of confidence in what you're talking about, you can maybe take someone's feedback either way. You could take it personally if you're not having a lot of confidence in kind of your subject matter or what you're talking about, and feel like you're being criticized, instead of taking that as something that could help you in your presentation moving forward.
Okay, that's a good point. So some of it can come from, if we're receiving feedback, our own mental state, how confident you are, how present you are, and that can impact the perception. That's a great answer. Any other thoughts? What's the difference between feedback and criticism?
I think to build off of Kathy's point, which was a wonderful point, I think your relationship with the person that you're interacting with is really important as well.
Yeah, sometimes when you get feedback from a stranger, it can come across as criticism.
Sorry,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to, this is Maria. I was just going to say that to me, criticism doesn't give the person receiving the message an opportunity to learn anything, whereas feedback does give the person receiving the message something to work from. You know, criticism to me, another verb that comes to mind, or adjective, I should say, is very emotional. Criticism is very personal, very emotional, whereas feedback is a little more thought through to me. So those are some differences that I see between the two.
It's a great point. Excellent answers. Any other thoughts? So if we look at the very base of this, one other thing that just comes to mind is that feedback, when you think about it, can just be straight positive. We've kind of looked at the negative aspect with these answers, right? But you can get feedback from someone, and the feedback can be, you did an awesome job on this. Here's what I appreciate about it. That's useful to us. We learn from it, and it's all positive. If we look at the difference between like constructive or negative feedback and criticism, I think it's exactly the things you all said. And very often it comes down to the intention behind it. The intention behind feedback, if it's going to be effective, should ultimately be to help someone improve, help them get better, or help to fix an issue. And very often that comes across in the delivery. So if you're taking notes and you want to jot down a simple definition for our purposes today for this workshop of effective feedback, we'll say that effective feedback is information given to a person based on their past performance that positively affects their future performance. Information given to a person based on their past performance that positively affects their future performance. Information given to someone based on their past performance that positively affects their future performance. And I don't know if that's a perfect definition, but just to kind of sum it up in a sentence. Now, even though that's a simple definition, there's two important points to it. And actually, you alluded to these. Number one, if feedback's going to be effective and useful, it should be based on performance or on facts. Sometimes criticism, as you mentioned, is solely based on emotion, opinion, and often the result isn't positive when that happens. And number two, if it really is going to be effective feedback, it should impact someone in a positive way going forward. So let's do this with that little definition in mind. Raise your hand. And if you got your video on, you can do it like this. If not, you can do the electronic hand raise. Raise your hand if you've either given someone feedback or received feedback from someone in, let's say, the last 24 hours. Let's start there. See what we get. All right, we got some hands. Keep them up. How about the last 7 days? Sometime in the last week. All right, sometime in the last month. Sometime in 2020. I think we got most of you who are able to raise your hand. So it's kind of a loaded question. There's a good chance that every hand should probably be up for 24 hours or at most 7 days, because here's the thing. In multiple areas of life, not just work, which might have been what you had in mind when I asked the question, we're almost constantly giving and receiving feedback. For example, a lot of us have been home with our families more than ever before in the past couple months. If you're married, if you have kids, or even if you have a roommate, we get almost constant feedback from the people that we spend time with, right? We get feedback from strangers. Virtually anytime you drive, even with traffic being as light as it is, feedback happens. Nonverbal, positive, negative. You want feedback right now, go walk around in an outside area with no mask on, and you'll get all kinds of nonverbal feedback from people just by their looks. So feedback's a constant process, right? We have simple examples like that. Then we have feedback that we get at work. Maybe informal feedback from a coworker or a client. Maybe a formal feedback setting, like a performance review. When it comes to feedback in the workplace specifically, it seems that people view it a little differently than they do feedback in their personal lives. And just to illustrate that, there's a couple facts on the handout under facts about feedback in the workplace. And I have to apologize because if you're looking at the handout, these got cut off. We shortened the handout. I've been doing this training in 3 hours and we shortened it to 60 minutes today. So we shortened the handout. And in some way, when we were doing that, these got cut off. So I'll read the full facts to you. And again, my apologies on that. The first one is actually taken from Office Vibe. It says 82% of employees appreciate feedback, both positive and negative. Second one, also from Office Vibe, 65% of employees said that they want more feedback than they're currently getting. And that last one I thought was interesting. It's taken from Harvard Business Review. 72% of employees feel that their performance would improve if they were given more constructive feedback. So not just feedback in general, but constructive feedback. Now, as you think about those facts, to me, they teach us two things. Number one, most people actually want feedback. They appreciate it, whether it's positive or negative, to the point where they feel like, hey, I'd actually be better at my job. My performance would improve if I got more of it. And the second one is apparently it's not happening as much as it should, specifically in the workplace, on the giving side. Now, you may agree with those numbers, you may not. This is just kind of a snapshot of general surveys, workplaces in America. There's exceptions, but most people want more than they're currently getting. So let's just talk about it for a brief moment before we dive into these three barriers. What's so challenging or difficult about feedback? Because if it was easy, A, those numbers wouldn't be what they are, and B, we wouldn't be in an hour-long class about how to do it. What's so challenging or difficult about feedback? What have you noticed?
I think to me, Tyler, one of the challenges that I found both for myself, but also in receiving feedback from people is that it's easier, I don't like using that word, but it's easier to point out things that need to be changed and much more difficult to help come up with solutions in order to work through that change.
That's a great point. So the problem's easy to identify. I agree with you on that, by the way. But actually making the feedback useful and identifying a solution is oftentimes difficult. What else? Any other thoughts? What's challenging about feedback? Here, I think you're muted, Emma.
There we go. I think another challenge is having fear about how that person is going to receive that feedback or interpret it, and maybe, especially if it's suggestions on improvement, there's a worry that they might get offended or it might tie them up in a way that you weren't intending.
Yeah, so the other person's reaction, if I'm giving feedback, especially if that feedback's asking them to change something, I might mean well, but do they perceive it that way, or do they perceive it as an attack? That can be a big challenge.
It's Carla from I'd say delivery, in how you deliver it.
Yeah.
And you may want to premise it. Your intent is not to create stress or harm. It's feedback according to you. It's your own opinion. And you premise it that way and let them experiment. I did it golfing once, helping someone. I said, look, if you want help, great. If you don't, just let me know. And then I gave feedback and left it at that.
Would you say golfing?
Yep.
Yeah, it's amazing how offended people will get if you mention anything about their golf swing sometimes. Definitely. You bring up a good point. Delivery is so much of it, right? Two people can give virtually the exact same piece of feedback to an individual, and one comes across as helpful and the other comes across as maybe criticism or personal. So put simply, feedback can be tough. It can be challenging for the reasons that you mentioned, but it is necessary. And we all can relate to that, right? None of us like receiving negative feedback in the moment, but if we don't get enough of it, it can impact our level of performance at our jobs and also in other areas of life. So we want to start out by discussing these three common barriers that kind of hinder feedback or at times make it ineffective. And let me just throw this out there before I give you the first one. When it comes to negative feedback, what would you say is most people's natural gut reaction when they receive negative feedback?
Get defensive.
All right, Stacy says get defensive. We agree with that? I see the heads nodding. It's almost universal. Now, this is before logic takes over, and for some people, logic never takes over. But the first thought is like kind of looking for a reason not to take the feedback. And there are many reasons why people choose to reject or not accept feedback, but we find they usually fall into one of three areas or three categories. And these are the three barriers at the bottom of your page there. So what we'll do is we'll discuss each one of these briefly, and then we'll watch a video to see how these can play themselves out in a workplace feedback setting. Barrier number one is very simple. Number one is truth. truth is number one. So we said most people's gut reaction to negative feedback is to be defensive or look for a reason not to take it, at least initially. When we receive feedback, this is usually the first question that we ask ourselves. Is the feedback true or not? Is it factual? And if you're receiving feedback and you identify that it's not true, or the person giving it doesn't have all the facts, what do you almost immediately do? You dismiss it, you toss it out. This barrier goes up between you and the giver. So if it's not true, you shouldn't take it. That's legitimate. Sometimes, however, the feedback might be true, but the person giving it isn't doing a good job of presenting it. So we don't perceive it as true, and it creates this same thing, barrier between giver and receiver. Number two is one of the most common. Number two is relationship. Relationship. So this second one has little, sometimes nothing to do with the content or the relevancy of the feedback. It's not a problem with the feedback itself that creates the barrier, but rather with the person giving it or with the relationship dynamic between the two people. And this is something that you all mentioned at the beginning. This is definitely one of the most common barriers. So if you picture yourself receiving feedback, right? If you've ever gotten feedback from someone that you don't like, or you don't respect, or you don't really feel like they're in a position to give you feedback, or you feel like they don't do the thing that they're telling you to do, it can create a barrier and cause us to not accept feedback. And this one's interesting because a relationship barrier can cause us to miss out on useful feedback simply because of who the feedback comes from, because of the source. I'll just share a real quick example of this. This is about 8 years ago. I was in 9 years ago, I guess. I was in sales, and the company that I worked for at the time hired a new sales manager. And right from the get-go, I could not stand this guy. His name was Phil. And if you ever work for someone or work with someone you don't really get along with, that's bad enough. But having that person be your manager takes it to a new level. And the thing that bothered me most about him is he was extremely blatantly dishonest, both with employees and also with customers. His sales philosophy was, look, any question that you're asked by a potential client, the answer is always yes. I'm like, well, what if it's no? He's like, it doesn't matter. You just say yes, get a signed contract. We'll deal with the rest later. Like, terrible way to do business. And he didn't last long because of it. But anyway, when it comes to feedback, he came to one of my sales presentations, and I'm driving home, and he calls me, and he says, Tyler, I know what your problem is. I'm like, oh, I have a problem. Good. He said, your problem is that when you talk to audiences, you're saying all the right things, but you're not really being genuine, and I don't believe you. So what you need to work on in your presenting style is to be more authentic, be yourself, be straightforward, be genuine, and you'll connect with people, and I think your sales will go up as a result of that. Now, that's pretty straightforward feedback, right? But you know what I thought about him as a person? As soon as he says the words genuine, straightforward, be yourself, be authentic, what am I thinking? Or what would you be thinking?
That's not him. So how does he have the authority or the reference experience to give you that advice?
Exactly.
Mirror.
No, I didn't.
Exactly.
What's that?
He should look in the mirror.
Exactly. No, I didn't verbalize any of that stuff. Verbally, I just said, okay, thanks, Phil, whatever. But I didn't do anything with the feedback, again, because of who it came from. Now, looking back, and almost a decade later, it's always easy to look back. It was actually really good advice. What he meant was, quit talking like a robot when you give a presentation. Don't memorize the words. Have a conversation. Be yourself. Connect with people. Good feedback? 100%. I know that because about a year later, I got that same feedback from my next boss, but this time I took it, and it did help me a lot. Here's the point. In the meantime, in the interim, I missed out on useful feedback, not because of the content or the relevancy of it, but simply because of what? The person that it came from. So this is a challenging barrier. But from the receiving side, the next time you get feedback from someone that you don't like or you don't respect, is it possible, and it's not usually possible in the moment, but even after a little time goes by, is it possible to try to separate the content of that feedback from the person that gave it to you? If I'm not able to do that, like we alluded to before, there's a good chance I can miss out on useful feedback. Sometimes, unfortunately, we get good feedback from people that we don't like that much, or we're not that fond of, or sometimes a total stranger. So I need to be able to separate the content of the feedback from the person. I know that's easy for me to say, it's really hard to do, but otherwise I can miss out on valuable information. Let's go to number 3.
Tyler, did you give him your feedback on him or not?
I didn't. I never did.
You should have, just to clear your conscience and your mind.
I at the time, I probably should have, but I don't know that it would have made a difference. But yeah, you're right.
Well, anyway.
So barrier number 3, if you're taking notes, number 3 is identity. Identity. So this is when the feedback is presented in a way that it somehow conflicts with or minimizes a person's values. It goes against their self-image. So even if the feedback's true, if it's presented in a fashion where this happens, there is a very good chance the person is going to get defensive and not accept the feedback. I'll just share a very quick example with you of an identity barrier. I was doing this program for a hospital in Baltimore, and Shelly, who's a nurse in the rheumatology department, she shared a great identity barrier. She said, this is 25 years ago. She's in nursing school, she's starting clinicals, and she just had her first son. So she's like super hectic time in life. And as a result, she was struggling with her clinicals. And one of her professors pulled her aside in a one-on-one and said, look, Shelly, the reason why you're struggling is because you have to make a choice that you haven't made yet. Are you going to be a full-time nurse, or are you going to be a full-time mom? Because you really can't be both. And she said that feedback totally conflicted with what?
Who she thought she is as a person.
Exactly, her identity. In her mind, she is
Both.
Exactly, both. So she said, looking back, his point was I needed to work on balance. I understand that. But again, even if the feedback's true, if it's presented in a way where it conflicts with a person's values or their self-image, the result's not going to be good. So let's watch a quick video here of a workplace feedback scenario. And give me a second here, I'm going to screen share to see how these barriers can play themselves out in workplace feedback. You guys seeing that? Okay, so this video, this is like a formal performance review type setting. I call this everything not to do at a performance review. I genuinely hope you don't have to work with anyone like the manager in this video. If you do, I'm really sorry. But as you watch this, and this is just a video I pulled off YouTube, as you watch this, just notice which barriers come up. Is it truth, relationship, identity, and what that does to the conversation. And then we'll discuss it after we watch it.
Wow, you look really tired. You need to work on your time management skills. Anyway, I remember the first time you were late. Hasn't really changed much since then. So did you complete your self-assessment?
Mm-hmm. I emailed it to you a couple weeks ago.
Well, obviously you didn't, because I don't have it in front of me. And you keep making excuses, so I guess I'm just going to have to write it now. I got some inside info from the office. Val said she makes a ton of excuses for everything. Val's so on it. I really wish she was my assistant. We're so similar.
She's always comparing me to Val. Like, that's even fair. They're practically the same person. Bossy? Patronizing? Who's going to see this?
Stop making excuses, Jenny, because honestly...
Jen, to it.
I'm going to have to do it right now. So,
Jen.
but, hello? Val, how you doing, girl? Oh, yeah, no, I'm not busy. You want to meet for lunch? Sure, let's meet at 1. Great, Val. Oh, wait, hold on. Let me do my open table app. I'll do that on my way down there. Okay, Val. I'll see you then.
Bye-bye. So that was rude. We don't meet all that often, and when we do, very rarely do we get through a conversation without her picking up her phone. I'd like to take that phone and drop it in a fishbowl.
Let's look at this evaluation form that I have to fill out. Okay, let's see. Performance, 5. Unacceptable, 5. Deadlines, 4. So Jenny, I've been meaning to ask you. Okay. Why are you late? Why are you late so often? And why are you not more diligent in completing your work on time?
I'm here every day by 8:30. I work 8:30 to 5:30. This is the first time that you're sitting down with me. I had no idea that you felt this way. I feel like you rarely acknowledge that I do anything right. I did this assessment 3 weeks ago, and I marked it on both of our calendars.
Well, then why don't I have
I'm trying my best.
If this is what she does when she tries, I would hate to see what she does when she doesn't try. Okay, I'm gonna do the talking now, all right? You're too quiet, you're boring, your desk is always messy, your food stinks, that fish smell stinks the whole office every other day. Okay, too many questions, and you never turn your receipts. I have to pick up your slack half the time. So you need to work on those things or your job is gonna be at risk. Okay, let's see how you do a year from now. I mean, I was told to give you a Bible verse, but to be honest with you, here, you need the whole Bible, okay? And why don't you wake up a little earlier in the morning and do your devotions, because that'll probably help you manage and have a better day. All right, goodbye. Listen, for my 4 o'clock meeting, get me a skinny latte.
Bye, Deb. So glad we had this conversation.
All right. Told you everything not to do. They even got a Bible in there at the end. We have a phrase for this. We call it an HR nightmare. Okay, so let's talk briefly about which barriers you saw come up. And you could probably say all of them. It's amazing what went wrong in 3 short minutes. But let me ask you this. So not only what did you notice, right, but like how did it play itself out? So if you say, I noticed a relationship barrier or a truth barrier, what contributed to that? What example from the video made that happen? So let me flip that on you guys. What did you notice? What barriers?
Well, she was immediately, the young lady was immediately put on the defensive by the boss because all she did was compare her to other people, give her negative feedback on literally every single thing she did, and not take any responsibility for her own actions in the lack of non-management of the young woman. That's what I saw anyway.
I was shocked too by the fact that if you don't even know someone's name, how does that set up a relationship of trust or awareness? If you don't have enough energy to get someone's name right, then it shuts off the hearing of everything else you say after that.
Yeah, that's a nice point. And, you know, unfortunately, some people do that on purpose. They mess your name up just a little bit to like assert their dominance. I love people like that. What else?
She started off, the boss was late, but she started off by saying that the employee was late. Why are you always late? Which was just right off the bat was really, you know?
Yeah, nice catch there. She comes in late and says, you look really tired. You need to work on your time management skills.
And you're always late. Yep.
Yep.
In truth, the young girl obviously did her report. Technology is notorious that you do something, you send it by email, and some people never get it. Either it goes in their junk mail or,
yeah.
And the boss was just, no, never, no. And she pleaded a couple times, but the boss denied it and wouldn't have anything to do to listen to her.
Yeah. Plus she took phone calls during the meeting. The boss took a phone call during the meeting, which is, there's nothing worse than meeting with someone and they're like this, like, hold on, this is more important. Or taking a phone call when you're meeting with someone, just turn it off and give that person your undivided attention.
For sure. You really see a lack of respect here, which probably comes from a relationship barrier, but that also impacts identity, right? No one wants to feel disrespected, especially when they're receiving constructive or negative feedback, and it creates an issue right off the bat. Nice comments. Any others?
I didn't even think that the feedback was constructive at all. It
That's
was a one-way conversation. They didn't discuss anything. It was just, you know, you do this, you don't do this, and that was it. I would have walked out personally.
Yeah.
I don't know if this was shown in the video exactly, but to piggyback on what Angela's saying about it being a one-way conversation, I think a good way to avoid things like this in a performance review are that I don't like to be surprised in my performance review. It's a good opportunity to discuss a behavior that's maybe problematic or ways to improve, but to feel blindsided by feedback, like if that person had no idea that she was being perceived as late all the time, that would be concerning. Like feedback should be given as issues arise rather than, you know, we're gonna deal with all of your problems all right now type issue.
And she wasn't even willing to meet with her for a year.
Yeah.
Exactly. So a formal review like this should not be the first time someone hears about something. It's not fair. And, you know, in certain cases, it's not, I don't want to use the word legal, but from an HR perspective, you can't document something in a setting like that, depending on the organization, that has never been brought to the person's attention in a formal review. So there was a lot of problems, and you kind of honed in on them nicely. Let's talk about briefly here from the giving side, okay? Because we've kind of examined these three barriers from the receiving side. Let's talk about from the giving side, what could have changed that may have helped to limit these barriers. So let's start with truth, and we'll just kind of go through these three briefly, and then we'll move on to our next section. There was a couple things they couldn't get to the truth on. Does she come in late? Is she there on time? Deb says you're always late. You need to work on time management. Jen says I'm here every day, 8:30 to 5:30. I don't know what you're talking about. Did she send the evaluation beforehand? Look, we watched this. If you're like me, I tend to side with Jen because Deb's just so mean and unprepared, but we don't actually know what the truth is. We're just watching a 3-minute video that I pulled off YouTube. So let's say that there is some level of truth to the fact that maybe she comes in late once in a while. What would you like to have seen the giver in this video do differently to help eliminate that truth barrier? What could she have adjusted?
Perhaps she could have been more specific in saying, I noticed that last Wednesday you came in late. Therefore, I don't know where that's going, but just to be more specific. I think that's much better when you're giving, feedback, especially if it's a, boss to a management person.
Yeah.
Sorry, couldn't think of the word.
Absolutely. So, two things that we learned from this bad example. Number one, and you've probably heard this before, but if you're going to give feedback, avoid absolutes. Words like always and never, Deb used a lot of them in this video. They're rarely true. And you're almost asking for a truth barrier in the other person when you use absolutes. Like if we pull the example from this video, if I say to you, why are you always late to work? I mean, gosh, it just seems like you're always late. What's your first thought? I'm not always late. I was just here on time today and yesterday and Friday. So you're almost asking for a truth barrier. And number two, and this is really important, if I'm going to give someone feedback, I really need to focus on their performance, not their personality. Focus on performance, not personality, and give examples of behavior, like you mentioned. So this is a vastly different conversation, like was brought out, if instead of saying, why are you always late? You need to work on managing your time. If she says, Jen, I noticed that, last Friday you didn't come in until 9:30 and on Monday you weren't here until 9:15. Is everything okay? Completely different conversation just by making that small adjustment and focusing on performance, giving examples of behavior. What about the relationship piece? We said that respect was missing between these two people. What else could have been changed, even in this meeting that you just watched, that might have affected the relationship?
It's Kim from Calgary. So
Hi, Kim.
I think it's important that even though there may be some key items that from a negative perspective that you want somebody to address, that they've got to feel that you've got their back and you see some good in them. Because I mean, I would have walked out of that meeting saying like, oh wow, is there anything about me you do like?
Yeah, so some genuine, straightforward, positive feedback could have changed the whole tune of this meeting. Now I say genuine, right? It doesn't mean, you know, make something up that doesn't exist, but if you can give genuine feedback to people, it's one of the positive feedback. It's one of the keys to effective working relationships. And then of course, like was mentioned, more frequent feedback, more frequent communication. These people are only meeting once a year, and that's not good for either side. Let's talk about the identity piece here just briefly. I don't think we mentioned this one. How was her identity sort of conflicted with here, her self-image?
I'm sorry, whose identity, Tyler?
The receiver, Jen.
Jen.
With 2 N's.
I think she was conflicted because she was being compared to someone who was not in her role. Her boss was always talking about some other person that she did not supervise. And so she's like, she doesn't even know my name, let alone my responsibility. And so I think that was a big confliction for Jen with 2 N's.
Yeah, great point.
And because Jen never received constructive feedback for the whole year, she thought her image and her identity was intact and everything was good. And then all of a sudden she gets lambasted in this meeting.
Yeah.
I've seen and almost been a part, not quite that bad of a meeting, and I did end up leaving the company. Just a heads up.
Good to know. So it's funny, you know, it's like we watch a video like this and the first thought is, well, that's really exaggerated. And it is, because it's meant to be kind of funny, but the examples of how these play themselves out happen all the time. It's like, okay, comparing the person to someone else, giving vague feedback without basing it on facts, talking too much, not being a good listener. Those things happen all the time in the real world. Now we just combined them all into one video here on what we showed. And then another part to the identity piece, I think, apparently someone told her she respected the Bible, I guess. She said, I'm supposed to give you a Bible verse. So we won't dive too deep into that one. But when it comes to, we've talked a good bit about truth and relationship from the giving side. Let's talk about the identity piece, and then we'll move on to our next section. Person's identity. If the feedback's presented in a way that it conflicts with or minimizes their values, there's a very good chance they'll get defensive or upset, or at very least won't accept the feedback. However, a person's identity can also do the exact opposite of that. When we give someone feedback, if the feedback is presented in a way that instead of conflicting with their values, it aligns with them, now instead of a barrier, the person's identity is actually helping you, because there's a much better chance they'll take the feedback and use it because it's aligned with what they want and with what's important to them. So when I was first given management training, one of the things I was told, and this wasn't the best advice, was if you have to give someone tough feedback, or even if you have to deliver bad news to someone, before you have the conversation, always take some time and think, if it was me receiving this information, how would I want it to be presented? And then go about it that way. And I mean, that's better than not thinking about it at all, but why is that bad advice on some level?
Because you're not the same person, and you might think that you're giving somebody advice the way that they want to be receiving it, but in fact you might be completely doing the opposite.
Exactly. I mean, how I might want to receive something could be the complete opposite of how that person wants to receive it. So, you know, now when I have to give someone challenging feedback or face a difficult conversation, I always try to think, what's important to them? What do they value? How do they see themselves? And again, not only do I want to make sure that I don't minimize or disrespect any of those things, but can I find a way to line the feedback up with what I know is important to them? So even on a more basic level, if you have to give feedback to someone that you work with, or to a customer or client. That's a challenge if the feedback's of a negative nature. I always try to think beforehand, even if I don't know the person that well, what do I know about them? Like, what are they focused on? What's important to them? What's their goal in all of this? Are we working towards the same thing? And if I can sort of line the feedback up with what I know they're focused on, what I know is important to them, what I know they value, it not only takes the barrier off the table, but there's a much better chance that the feedback will be well received and actually be useful to the person getting it. So just something to think about on that last one. All right, so those are the three: truth, relationship, identity. We've kind of picked these apart from both sides. Questions or thoughts on these? Okay, let's go on to our next section then. If you flip over, if you're using the handout, if you go to your page number 2, at the top it says creating a culture of feedback. So we're going to consider 2 major principles that impact people's view of feedback, how naturally it happens, and how often it happens. And these principles are really important. We're going to talk about techniques here in a couple minutes, but honestly, if the culture is wrong in your organization or on your team, all the techniques in the world don't make that much of a difference. And they'll help, but they don't make a huge difference. And vice versa. If the culture is right, the techniques happen more naturally, and it's like you don't have to think about it or try as hard to make feedback effective. So these 2 principles are really important. They're simple, but each one also has a crucial or self-reflective question to think, how can I impact this culture, both with myself and with the people that I work with? Principle number 1 to creating a culture of feedback is creating a culture of learning and growth. Learning and growth is number 1. And if you're taking notes, you can jot down the words candor and honesty as well to this principle. They're closely linked. Learning and growth, candor and honesty. So this just makes sense when you think about it, right? If I have a group of people, let's say, for example, that all of us on this Zoom, we all work together, the same team, same company, and each one of us genuinely values constantly learning, growing, improving at what we do, and always being better. If we genuinely value learning and growth to that level, how do we view feedback?
Positively. You look forward to it.
Yeah, learning and growing. That's what it is.
I ask questions.
To
seek understanding.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
When I'm faced with a situation that's potentially confrontational, I'll seek to ask questions of someone to get a better understanding of their perspective.
That's a great point. Yeah, instead of just jumping to conclusions, right? It almost forces you to be a little more open-minded. So the idea here is the more value that people place on learning, growing, and improving, they're not only open to feedback, but they actually seek it out. They need feedback. It becomes a necessity because sure, I can self-examine to some extent, but I also need feedback from other people, from the people around me, people I work with, clients, customers, my manager, whoever it is that you deal with. Let's go to the self-reflective question on this one, or the crucial question. And it's a very simple question. How often do I ask for specific feedback at work? That's it. How often do I ask for specific feedback? How often do I ask for specific feedback? In other words, it's really easy to say, yes, I value learning and growth. It's important to me. And by the way, pretty much everyone does. I mean, if I was to go around right now and ask each one of you, hey, do you value learning and growth? What's everybody going to say? Yeah, totally. I mean, it's important, right? But the question is, in other words, do I show it? How often am I asking for feedback? Am I seeking it out? Share a quick story with you that illustrates this principle nicely. It's a story about David Novak, who was the longtime CEO of Yum Brands. Anyone know what Yum Brands owns? YUM? Care to share? See a couple of you nodding your heads.
They own Pizza Hut, Taco Bell.
Quick service.
Yeah, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, KFC, Long John Silver's, several other chains. Actually, I just heard recently they are number 2 in the world in the way of restaurant chains, second only to McDonald's, still number 1. But number 2 is up a lot from where they were years ago, and a lot of that growth is attributed to their longtime CEO, David Novak. He ran the company for about 15 years, and during that time grew revenues by 800% and took them kind of from being a middle of the pack right up to the top 1 or 2 worldwide. So there's a story about when he became a new CEO. The company was flatlined, they weren't growing, the culture needed work, so they hired this new CEO, David Novak, to come run the company. And when they hired him, they held this kickoff meeting for him to meet with the senior leaders of the company and to kind of share his vision and for the culture he wanted to create and how they would grow. And so he shows up to this meeting and he's dressed kind of like you'd expect a new CEO to look. He's got a nice suit on, he's put together, but he wore this tie that was just hideous, apparently. Like it was all these different shades of brown and dark red, and it had what looked like patches of fur going across it diagonally. Now it turned out to be felt, but apparently this thing was just hideous. Like when you looked at him, it's the first thing you saw. Stuck out like a sore thumb. So he's at this meeting, and before he starts, he's meeting people for the first time. He's their new CEO. A lot of people hadn't been introduced to them yet, so people are coming up introducing themselves, and he starts like casually pulling people off to the side, and he's like, hey, I gotta ask you something. I know that you just met me, you don't really know me that well, but I just gotta ask, like, what do you think of my tie? Did I pull it off? Does it work? What's everybody say?
Looks great.
You got it.
It's awesome.
Yeah, it looks good, man. You're right. It's not really traditional, but I think you pulled it off, or I think it matches your shoes, or just all this. Apparently, not one person, the story goes, said no, that's ugly, or no, it doesn't work. He just got yeses from everybody. So they introduce him. He starts the meeting, and he says, guys, I'm supposed to talk about our culture here at Yum Brands. I can tell you already, we have a huge problem. And apparently, the whole room just fell silent. You don't expect your new CEO to lead with that. What's he say? Is the huge problem.
You all liked my tie. That's a big problem.
Exactly. Honesty and candor. He said, look, this is the ugliest tie known to man. You know the lengths I had to go to find something like this? They don't just manufacture this stuff. If you can't be honest with me, and here's the point, about something as simple and straightforward as a necktie, a piece of clothing, how are you ever going to be honest with me about something as complex and important as how I'm doing as your leader, the vision that we're creating, or the culture that we're creating, and my vision for the company? Did they get the point? Loud and clear, right? Now, this is one of those ideal circumstances because when it starts at the top, it naturally trickles down and spreads out. But here's a question for you. What if this principle, learning and growth, candor and honesty, sort of like transparency, what if it doesn't start at the top in your organization or on your team? Because we don't live in an ideal world. I mean, I've definitely worked for companies where the opposite culture came down from the top. What if it doesn't start at the top? What then?
If it doesn't start at the top, then the rest of the people will all be affected. And that, over time and experience, in my experience, as you figure out what your culture is or what your right culture is, if you don't see that culture at the beginning and the behavior of management or leaders, then it's probably not the right place for you, or it'll be a temporary stay, essentially.
Yeah. So that's one option, right? If the culture's not there, you can quit and go somewhere else. It's a realistic option. What else?
I think it trickles down to every level. So if there isn't that culture at the very top, then people repeat what they see and what they get from the top. So it's going to keep going down and down the levels where they're repeating non-honesty and non-respect, and they're not using candor and honesty.
Yeah, so that principle flows from the top down. It doesn't really flow from the bottom up. And I'm sure there's people that would debate that. There's exceptions to that. But in most cases, it doesn't flow from the bottom up. So here's a question, though. No matter what the culture is, right? At the end of the day, who's the only person I can really control? Myself. So that's why that self-reflective or crucial question for this principle was not how often does my boss ask for feedback, or how often does how well does leadership do? The question is, how often do I ask for specific feedback? I'm the only person I can really control. And any of you on here who are managers, you have a couple people who report to you, or maybe you own a business, you really have a big impact on this principle because it does come down from the top. But even if we're not, we can still impact to some extent the people around us, and we can get useful feedback when we ask for it more. Those of you that wrote this question down, it wasn't just how often do I ask for feedback, but how often do I ask for, see the gesture, yes, specific feedback. So why is that word important when it comes to seeking out or asking for feedback? Why did we throw that word specific in there?
Because you want to avoid any kind of a level of assumption. You might, be curious about feedback for one thing, and your boss or whoever it is that you're working with might be giving you feedback about something else, and the lines of communication get fuzzy then.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I was thinking maybe it's not you being proactive about receiving feedback. You're kind of putting the burden on someone else, and not if you just say like, can I have feedback versus can I have feedback on some specific thing that's going on.
Yeah, that's very true. And I've noticed, when I ask for general feedback, usually you get general answers. So one of the things I would always do in performance reviews is, as a manager, is at the end you say, some of you have probably done this, right? You say, okay, so now it's your turn. What feedback do you have for me? How am I doing as a manager? 90% of the time, what do people answer that question with? That's it. Oh, no, it's good. Everything's good. No problems. Everything's good. Thank you. No, I'm happy. Everything's good. It's like, well, that's nice, but that's not what I really was looking for. So the more specific you are with the question, the more likely you are to get useful feedback. Instead of, if we piggyback on that example, instead of how am I doing as your manager, hey, what's one thing that I could do for you that I'm not currently doing in the next 6 months or in the next 30 days that would help you out? In my business, right? Instead of saying, what did you think of the training? What did you think of the work about it? What was your least favorite part? If you had to pick something to change, what would it be? What do you feel the most useful part of the training was? So questions like that, again, you'll still have people who go, no, everything's good, but you're more likely to get specific, useful feedback when you're specific with the questions. Now, it does take some vulnerability, because you never know what people are going to say when you open that door. But if I really value learning and growth and candor and honesty, it might be a little uncomfortable in the moment to hear, but it definitely helps long term. So how often do I ask for specific feedback? If you think about that honestly and you think, well, I could ask a little more from different sources, I encourage you to give that some thought when this training's over today. Let's go to principle number 2, to creating a culture of feedback. And principle number 2 is creating a culture of care and connection. Care and connection. Not trying to get all warm and fuzzy on you here, but put simply, if people know that you care about them and that you're coming from a genuine place when you give feedback, it makes virtually any conversation easier. Not easy, still might be challenging, but easier, because there's legitimate trust between the two people, and it takes care of so many of like the hidden issues behind feedback. Let's go right to the crucial question on this one. It's a really important question for today's training. If you're taking notes, crucial question for principle 2, how frequently do I give positive feedback at work? That's it. How frequently do I give positive feedback at work? one of the best ways to show people that you care about them, that you're interested in them, and also to build effective working relationships is to give genuine, deserved, positive feedback on a regular basis. Again, I emphasize those words, genuine and deserved. It doesn't mean you have to make stuff up or patronizing comments or any of that stuff, but genuine, deserved, positive feedback is so important. Now, we know this. I'm not telling you anything new here. I've heard this before. We know positive feedback is a good idea. Apparently, most people aren't doing it, especially when it comes to working environments. And let me share with you why I say that. There was a study published a few years ago in 2018 called The State of the American Workplace by Gallup. And Gallup did this enormous survey. They said they got over 3 million responses to this survey from people of all different industries. I mean, everything from nonprofits to Fortune 500 companies to manufacturing, construction, the whole across the board. There's a question in the survey about positive feedback. The question is phrased something like this: in a typical week, how much positive feedback or praise do you receive at work? They were allowed to select numbers. Any guesses what number 70% of respondents gave 2018? That's it. 0. And I'll never forget, I was sitting there when that was published reading it. I'm like, there is no way that's true. 70% of people who go to work in America are getting 0 positive feedback in a typical week. And then, I'm sorry, maybe you Canadian folks who signed on here have a different number there. I hope so. But then I thought, man, it's hard to argue with 3 million people. I mean, there's got to be some level of truth to that. So one of two things: either it's really not happening, or it's happening, but people don't perceive it as positive feedback. So when they answer the question, they still say 0. Actually, let me flip this on you. What are your thoughts on this? Is it really not happening? Is it just perception? Or if you think positive feedback isn't happening, why not?
I don't necessarily think that it's not happening. I definitely think that people try to make it a point to provide positive feedback for all the reasons that you've given. I just think it's less effective when you provide positive feedback and then you turn around and either demonstrate something negative or follow it with something negative, and you almost negate the entire positive feedback experience.
Yeah. It's really rare that you just get straight positive feedback. And usually when it happens, it's memorable. But when it's followed by something negative, or when it's negated by action, that kind of makes it either meaningless or less meaningful.
Tyler, in the US, do you have Secretary's Day or Admin Assistant's Day? You do. That's mostly when you give feedback to those people, maybe not your managers per se, but people that work for you. That's what happens here anyway.
So why are we leaving it to one day a year to give feedback to people that actually do a service that helps us every day? I'm not trying to sling accusations here. I'm just sorry, I'm just asking a question.
I think, hi, this is Stacy. I think you do also have to make almost a conscious decision, or not decision, but I think you do have to really think about actually giving that positive feedback. And I know I've worked with a lot of people who it just always seemed to be like, gosh, it's like you're harping on every little thing that might have gone wrong in the process versus all of the things that went right in the process. And when I made the switch from an individual contributor to managing a team, I really think about it on a regular basis about giving that positive feedback and saying thank you and praising the team, because I know how important it is. But I also see it from the other side now, where you're getting, as a manager, pushed down so much information, so much pressure, so many metrics that need to be hit, that what's always on the forefront and top of mind is, we've got X, Y, and Z that we need to be accomplished. And those are the things I need to make sure I'm talking with my team about. And you almost forget that, oh yeah, I also need to be continuing to give them the positive feedback, the reinforcements, and everything else, because I know the people I'm reporting to are not saying, hey, Stacy, don't forget to say good job.
Right.
What's coming down to me. hey, Stacy, where are your numbers at? You know, so I think you have to really, as a manager, almost remind yourself on a daily basis to be doing that.
That's really well summed up. And look, if you are a manager, you can relate to that. But even if you're not, I mean, it's our brains, at least mine, when it's related to work, is always looking for what's wrong, how do we fix it? What's wrong, how do we fix it? And maybe that's part of being a manager and business owner, right? But I think of times even when I wasn't, it was what's wrong, how do I fix it? So it takes intention, deliberacy to not only notice the things that are going well, but then take the time to give meaningful, positive feedback to the people that are doing those things. Again, whether you're a manager, business owner or not, we can all impact the people that we work with, and we all have people that we deal with on a regular basis that deserve positive feedback and perhaps aren't getting it. So let me ask you this. What are some ways that you can think of to make positive feedback more meaningful? Because most of us probably think, well, I say thank you. I'm a polite person. Isn't that positive feedback? And we're not going to get into that debate because that can be a 15-minute whether thank you is positive feedback or not. But I'll say some people say yes, some say no. What can you do without taking a whole lot of extra time if you want to make positive feedback more meaningful?
Maybe you could give a little feedback to that person on how what they did affected you and why you appreciate it. And just saying, instead of just saying thank you, like add another sentence to it to make it actually, you know, mean something to them about why you're saying it. Because it really helps when you keep me in the know of what's going on for the company or what have you.
I like what you said. People say, I don't have time for that. It's literally like a sentence or two. It doesn't take a lot. Maria, did you?
Yeah, no, I was going to basically agree with Kathy, definitely. Just as with constructive feedback, you want to be specific. With positive feedback, you want to be specific as well.
Yeah.
Tyler, at our company, we have a performance management program called TrackStar, and the 200 employees are separated between manager, players, and coaches. And the program that we use allows anybody in the company to leave a note for anyone else in the company. So I'm very lucky. The woman I mentor is amazing, and all day long, every week, she's getting notes from other employees on what she's done to help them and how she's made their job easier. And when we meet once a week, she's like, I can't tell you how much this means to me, and you know how much better my job has been since we've started this, because I know that people appreciate and see the things that I'm doing. And people utilize the program. They're excited about it. And it has changed the morale in the office. And even with everything going on now and us mostly working remote, they're still using the program and they're still building each other up. And we've seen a huge difference in employee morale.
That's awesome, because a lot of organizations have similar programs, but it's not getting used. That's really great to hear.
I'll make one other comment, and this is kind of a cultural company thing. Years ago when I was at a company where there were informal settings where managers, owners could communicate, whether it be birthday parties, birthday cakes, or one birthday cake for the month of June, etc., where you have informal places where you can have less formal work discussions and i.e. appreciation areas.
Yeah, so sort of having the avenue to do that. And along the lines with kind of what you bring up, Carla, and also Allison, if you don't have that opportunity, if you don't have a performance management software that you can do that with, or if we don't have those informal opportunities that Carla mentioned right now because of how we're doing business at this time, there are still other ways that are really simple to provide positive feedback. You know, for example, if you receive feedback related to a project from someone that you worked with, or from a higher up in your company, or from a client, I mean, whenever I receive something like that, if it's written, I try to send it out to everyone who had a hand in it. And it's so easy. It's easy to do that. It's just as easy not to do it and to look at it and go, oh, great, that person appreciated it. But just like something small like that can make a difference. Also, we mentioned written feedback. It doesn't take but a couple sentences to send someone an email. It takes a little more time to write them maybe a handwritten thank you card. That's old fashioned for some people. But what do people often do with written feedback that's positive? They save it. If it's handwritten, they put it on their board above their desk. If it's an email, I know a lot of people that keep a separate folder just for positive feedback that they put emails in that are positive, and that way when they're having a bad day, they can go back and look at them. So
I just thought of one other thing. LinkedIn has a feature that you can send little recognition pushes out so society, the workforce, can acknowledge positive feedback.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's a great way to do it. That's kind of, public, and I don't know, public's the word, but other people can see it. So that can be a positive thing. If all of this isn't motivation enough to give a little more positive feedback, there was a study done by Work Trends a couple years ago, and they surveyed about 20,000 employees, and they measured their engagement and they compared that with their survey. And they found that people who receive weekly positive feedback at work, or who reported receiving weekly positive feedback at work, are 72% more likely to be highly engaged at their jobs than those that don't. So if, it's the right thing to do, it makes people feel better, all that stuff's great. But if all that's not enough motivation, people you work with are 72% more likely to be highly engaged when they get positive feedback on a weekly basis. So we can't control how much we get when it comes to positive feedback, but we can control how much we give. And I find personally, the more I give, the more I get. So just something to think about on that last question. How frequently do I give positive feedback at work? Could I maybe give it a little more often? Look for opportunities to do that. And could I look for some ways to make it more meaningful? Okay, let's move on to our techniques. We're going to talk about 4 techniques for giving feedback effectively, 4 techniques for receiving it well, and then we'll wrap our training up. I think we'll leave, we're till 1:30, right, Emma? Okay, so we'll try and leave a couple minutes for Q&A at the end. Techniques for giving feedback effectively. These are 4 things, and these are not all inclusive. I pulled these out of a 3.5-hour workshop that I do, so there are more, but I thought these were the 4 most impactful. Number 1, be solution focused. Be solution focused. When you are solution focused as the person giving feedback, what's it do for the person receiving it? Hopefully. What's it do for them?
It shows them that you put a lot of thought into it.
Yeah.
Gives them an action to do something with whatever you told them.
Absolutely. And it can also help to take the feeling of being blamed or being focused on to the feeling of, hey, we're just focusing on finding a solution to an issue. So it can sometimes help take the personal out of it, especially when you have to give tough feedback. This is a really good idea. And also, I like to start the conversation out by letting the person know that's my intention. We have this issue we need to talk about. The only reason I'm bringing it up is because I want to find a solution to it. I want to fix this problem. But it's also a good idea to be solution focused throughout the conversation. Feedback conversations don't always go as planned. Sometimes the 2 sides don't agree. The other person doesn't agree with you. They don't see things the same way. A skilled communicator is able to, like when the wheels start coming off, is able to say, look, I'm sorry we're not on the same page with this, but we need to figure out a way to fix it. What do you think we can do? So being solution focused, it's good idea at the beginning of the conversation, but also throughout the conversation when giving feedback. Number 2, be direct and be specific. We talked about the importance of being specific with positive feedback. It's also important with negative or constructive feedback, but let's just take each one of these briefly. First of all, be direct. One of the things that I was taught to do when I was given management training, and a lot of us have been taught to do, is anytime you give negative feedback, I was told this as a rule. The best way to do it is to do this thing called the sandwich. Have you heard of this before? All right, 1 or 2 of us have. Can someone tell me what the sandwich is?
I can.
Go ahead.
If you have negative feedback to give, you basically give them some positive feedback first, then the negative, and follow it up with some positive. So you're sandwiching the negative in between two positives.
Yeah. I'm going to go against a lot of trainers here because most people say to do the sandwich. Let me ask you this. What are some of the problems with the feedback sandwich?
Hi, this
Get
is
lost in
Kiki.
translation.
I find that you don't focus on actually resolving what the problem is, because you might then just focus on what was last stated. So if you want to give the feedback, you don't want to just give it and put it out there and not have an outcome. You want to actually resolve it. So when you sort of muddle the message, it's sort of being, like passive aggressive. Like you're not going to solve anything. You're just sort of checking the box at that point. Well, I told them, but they didn't do anything about it. Well, you didn't really address it,
Right. And I've noticed, I really hate the sandwich when I can tell someone's doing, like when I'm receiving feedback and I can tell someone's doing it. How do the positives come across?
Like filler.
It doesn't seem genuine.
Yeah. It's like, oh, they were just doing this so they could give me this negative piece of feedback. So I think most people appreciate it. Be direct, get to the point. And look, if you're giving positive feedback regularly, like we talked about in the last principle, you don't feel the need to do the sandwich as much. It's like, I'm direct with my positive feedback. I can be direct when I have to give you some constructive or negative feedback as well. And also that second part, be specific. Sometimes our tendency, if we have to deliver tough feedback to someone, the thought process is, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want them to get upset. So I'll just deliver the feedback, but I'll be really nice and generalize it. And the intention behind that is good. It's good that you want to be nice. And we're not saying to be rude or unkind. That's why we say be solution focused. But when it comes time to share the feedback, be straightforward, be direct, be specific, share an example of what it looks like, the behavior like we talked about earlier. Being vague might be easier in the moment, but long-term it can be worse for both sides, the person giving and the person receiving. Number 3, under techniques for giving feedback, ask for the person's thoughts and listen. Ask for their thoughts and listen. So effective feedback should not be a lecture or a speech. It should be a conversation, dialogue between two people. Ask for their thoughts and listen. And number 4, create a plan together. Create a plan together. So to me, every feedback or really any performance conversation should leave with some kind of plan. It doesn't mean we know the solution. We might not, but it should always end with 3 things. Who will do what by when? And that's simple but important. Who will do what by when? Including me, by the way, if I'm the person who's bringing this up and giving feedback. What do you need from me in the next week to help you with this? What can I do this month to help you out on what we've talked about? So who will do what by when? Create some kind of action plan. It's not an effective conversation unless there's a plan. So those are just a couple simple techniques for giving feedback effectively. And I encourage you as you think about these, because none of them are new. I didn't tell you anything you haven't heard before. The question is not, do I know this stuff? We all do. The question is, if I look at myself honestly, am I actually doing each of these? Or am I letting some of them slip? Am I a good listener when I give someone feedback? Am I open to their perspective? Am I direct and specific, or do I tend to sugarcoat things? Am I solution focused? They're small changes, but they can make a huge difference in the result of the conversation. Let's talk, excuse me, let's talk about 4 techniques for receiving feedback, and then we'll open this up to some questions here. So as much as we all give feedback, we also receive feedback. 4 simple things, especially when the feedback's not pleasant, that can help you to accept it well and get some value out of it if there's any to be had. Number 1, control emotion. And we could probably just say that one and be done. But look, no matter how mature you are and how committed to growth you are, negative feedback, it almost always feels personal, at least in that first moment when we receive it. And that is magnified if the person delivering the feedback isn't doing a great job. Maybe they're not controlling their emotions, they're a little frustrated, and that can, make it even more challenging. But I have to control emotion if I want to get use from the feedback I receive. And to me, at the core of this is I have to be open-minded, like genuinely open-minded to feedback. When it comes to feedback that's related to work, most of us work very hard at what we do. You've got years, maybe decades of experience. You're well educated probably. That requires time, money, we invest a lot in our profession, what we do for a living. All that being said, I hope you're excellent at what you do. If you're excellent at what you do, that comes with a natural level of pride. Hey, I'm great at what I do. I should be proud of that. However, there's still got to be this place in my brain, in your brain, where we think, you know what, I can always be better. I can always be better. And who knows where the next piece of feedback might come from that can help me to do that. The minute that open-mindedness goes away, it makes it almost impossible to receive feedback rationally and to, receive it without a defensive reaction. So if you think about if you've ever worked with someone like that, or if you do work with someone like that who just thinks they're at the top and there's no room for improvement, it makes it almost impossible to give the feedback. So control emotion, be open-minded. Those two things are linked. Number two, also linked to this first one, actively listen. Not just listen, but actively listen. So you've probably heard this before. There's a communication gap between a person talking and a person listening. The average person can speak about 150 words per minute. The average person can mentally process about 500 words per minute. So put simply, we can think at least 3 times faster than someone can talk. Now, all the training on listening says, you're supposed to use that gap to summarize what the person's saying, listen without bias, listen to understand. In the real world, especially if we haven't done step 1, what do we often use that gap to think about?
Our response.
Our response, what we're going to say next, our rebuttal. And that's human nature. The problem is when we're doing that, we're not actually listening. Sure, you might be listening, but you're listening to respond, not to understand. So actively listen. That to me comes down to controlling that internal dialogue, which is really a challenge to do. Number 3, ask clarifying questions. Ask clarifying questions. So sometimes a person gives us feedback, or maybe we receive written feedback via an email or a text message, and it might be kind of vague. And we use that as an excuse to just dismiss it. Say, well, it's not specific, so it probably doesn't have any basis in truth. A good receiver is willing to ask clarifying questions. Not everyone is as skilled as they should be at giving feedback. So sometimes there might be value there, but you have to dig for it a little bit. And just asking for some examples and being willing to clarify can help to get that value if there's any to be had. Number 4, sort the feedback for relevancy. A lot to fit on that line there. Sort the feedback for relevancy. So is all feedback worth taking? No, sometimes the person might not have all the facts, might be untrue. So I've got to be willing to look at the feedback objectively and kind of sort it out. And this last step can lead to further clarification, right? We talked about asking clarifying questions. I find my natural tendency is to sort all the feedback out while the person's talking, like during the conversation, but we're not always in the best state to do that. So sometimes a good portion of this sorting can be done afterwards, maybe 10 minutes after the conversation, or if it was particularly difficult, maybe we need more time, a few hours or a day later, we can sort the feedback out, and that can lead to further clarification and follow-up. So again, just a couple simple things to think about on the receiving side of feedback. The same question as last time, not do I know this stuff, but if I look at myself honestly, am I actually doing it? Do I really control my emotions when I receive feedback? Do I actively listen? or am I just listening to prove the person wrong to respond to them? Do I ask clarifying questions, and am I able to rationally sort the feedback for relevant pieces? Just a couple things to think about on that. Okay, so as we wrap this training up, I just encourage you to, we've considered a lot of information, right? We've considered these barriers, how to navigate them from both sides. There's two core principles to creating a culture of feedback and these techniques that we just discussed. I hope that you can find maybe one or two small adjustments that you can make that can impact your ability to give and receive feedback. And I seriously want to thank you guys for your time today. Thank you for all your participation. You're great. I appreciate it. And I think we've got maybe 5 minutes for any questions on anything we've talked about. And if not, we'll turn it back over to Emma to kind of wrap things up. How about outbursts? Sorry.
I'm just curious if you have any feedback to maybe help with some of the barriers that we discussed earlier. You know, how what can we be focusing on mentally to kind of help us to maybe get in a better mindset to either hear the truth in some people's feedback, or maybe work on the relationship dynamic between people you may work with if there is that barrier there?
So, you know, to me, and asking how to get in the mindset for that is a hard question to answer. But, you know, to me, it comes down to value. I have to really value feedback and think about areas that I can improve on, and also how that improvement would benefit me. Because if I don't, pretty much anytime there's an excuse to not take the feedback, I'm going to roll with the excuse, right? Oh, this person doesn't know me. Oh, who do they think they are giving me this feedback? And still, that might be my initial gut reaction. But that's one of the things that we kind of brushed over it quickly. But if I can sort of let some time go by and then maybe revisit that feedback just mentally, after a few hours or maybe a few days goes by, it can help me to perhaps get some value out of it. And when it comes to the truth piece, I know that was relationship. You also mentioned truth. You know, just being willing to, from the receiving side, to ask for examples. Like if someone gives me feedback and I don't really know what it means, again, instead of jumping to the conclusion of, well, I don't know what they're talking about, just digging, asking clarifying questions. Can you give me an example of, you know, how I behaved that way, or what I did that made you think that? Or can you give me an example of how I could have been more creative with this project or with this article, whatever it is. So, and again, it's like we talked about, I think that at the core is open-mindedness. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer, but hopefully that. Other questions, thoughts?
Do you have any different techniques depending on maybe the age of the person that you're talking to? Because we're a multi-generational workforce, at least in my company. So we have the millennials and we have people of just different generations. And sometimes I think it's a little different with who your audience is.
Yeah, so I've been there as well. To me, it goes back to the identity piece and really getting to know the person, which isn't always possible depending on the size of your organization. But, you know, to the extent possible, having an awareness of what the person values. And I think giving feedback to someone of a younger generation is challenging. But one of the things that I've been faced with is you become a manager and now you're giving feedback to people who are 20 years or more older. And that to me is even a greater challenge. So I think just really showing respect when you deliver feedback and being solution focused, like we talked about, has been key to me when there's that big generational gap. If the person's a lot older, making sure they know that I respect that. And even though I might have more experience in the field or in the industry, they probably have more life experience. So making sure they understand that level of respect. And also, I think even giving feedback to younger folks, you know, our first thought is like, oh, they're entitled, or oh, they're kind of a punk, or whatever the thought process is. But honing in on the respect piece, you know, letting them know that I do respect them and appreciate what work they do, can help them to be more open-minded to the feedback. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have said that people of younger generations are entitled. I was just speaking in generalities. Don't take that as other questions? All right, well, thank you guys again so much.
Tyler.
Turn it back over to you, Emma.
Yeah, Tyler, thank you so much. That was such a great session. I know I certainly learned a lot, and I know we wish we could have hosted you in real life, but someday in the future we'll get to. So thank you for joining us, and I'll throw out a quick reminder to everyone. There's a few upcoming events for Crew Philly. This week on Thursday, we have a networking lunch around. On Monday, June 8th, we have a virtual cocktail swap and networking happy hour. And then on Wednesday, June 17th, we're hosting another webinar called I'm No CPA, A Guide to the CARES Act and Commercial Real Estate for the Rest of Us, which I will definitely be attending because I'm no CPA. So thanks everybody for jumping on today. And thanks again to our sponsors for hosting, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you. You too. This is great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Nice job hosting, Emma.
Thank you.